Elna had prayed her whole life to feel closer to God. She just never imagined that closeness would come through her own body. At 28, she had done everything right. Devotion without doubt, service without question, purity without exception. Her students called her Sister Elna, the woman who smiled softly, spoke gently, and never seemed tempted by the world outside the chapel walls. But beneath that calm faith lived a silence too deep to name. She had never felt desire, and she called that holiness. The contradiction began quietly. A man she met at a retreat, kind eyes, unhurried voice, asked her questions no sermon had ever raised. When you pray, do you breathe? It was harmless until it wasn't, because for the first time, her breath caught. Something inside her shifted that day, not rebellion, but recognition, as if her soul had been living in one room of a vast house, and someone had finally opened another door. She tried to pray it away, tried to fast, to fight, to forget. But the body remembers what truth feels like, even when the mind calls it sin. That night, in the stillness of a cabin far from her church, she felt a kind of awakening she didn't have a name for. Half sacred, half forbidden. Was it betrayal or revelation? This is the story of a woman who discovered that sometimes faith doesn't end when pleasure begins. It changes form and finally becomes real. Before that night, Elna's world was made of certainty. Her mornings began with scripture and silence, her evenings with soft hymns that kept doubt at a distance. The rhythm of her days felt safe, measured, unchanging. In the small town of Provo, Utah, she was known not by her first name, but by her devotion. Students brought her flowers on her birthday. Parents called her a blessing. The church elders said she carried grace in her posture. But grace, she was beginning to learn, can also be a disguise. Her classroom was a sanctuary, neat, sunlit, orderly. She taught ethics and spiritual discipline to teenage girls, reminding them that purity was strength, that temptation was a test. They listened, wide-eyed, taking notes on obedience as if it were a formula. Some days she wondered if they saw through her, if they noticed how she paused before saying words like love or desire. She had been taught that discipline was a form of love and denial a form of faith. Still, sometimes her chest tightened when she said, "Your body is sacred," because hers didn't feel sacred. It felt absent. At home, her apartment reflected her life. Minimal, quiet, predictable. She avoided mirrors after showers, dressed in layers even when summer came early. When she prayed, she focused on the ceiling to avoid catching her own reflection in the window. She knew every line of doctrine, but could not describe the shape of her own longing. At 28, she had never been kissed. Not really. There had been a man once, years ago, a kind missionary who left for another state before anything could bloom. She told herself it was for the best. Love, after all, was supposed to be eternal, not physical. Still, there were nights when she felt something stir inside her, like a faint hum she could not silence. She pressed her palms together tighter, whispered verses louder, as if prayer could erase pulse. But the body, as she would later understand, has its own form of memory, one that scripture cannot rewrite. When her principal announced a partnership between the school and a secular educational foundation in California, Elna volunteered to represent her class at a training workshop. "You'll be the perfect example of grace under pressure," he said, smiling. She nodded, though the thought of leaving her safe orbit both thrilled and terrified her. The retreat was held in Oregon, a week-long exchange of teaching philosophies. But on the third day, a colleague invited her to an off-site spiritual embodiment circle. The words alone unsettled her. Embodiment. It sounded too physical, too exposed. "It's just breathing and stillness," her colleague assured her. "You'll love it. It's like prayer without words." She almost said no. Instead, curiosity overrode fear. Inside the lodge, candles flickered against cedar walls. Women sat cross-legged, eyes closed, palms on their hearts. The instructor's voice flowed through the air, low and rhythmic. "Inhale as if you are being welcomed. Exhale as if you are finally safe." Elna tried to follow. At first it felt ridiculous, childish even. But then something shifted. Her breath deepened. Her heartbeat slowed. She felt the weight of her body settle into the floor. For a brief, fragile moment, she wasn't performing. She wasn't pure or impure. She was just there, breathing. When she opened her eyes, the instructor was smiling gently. "That," she said, "is what it feels like when the body says yes." The sentence lingered in her mind long after she returned to her hotel. For years, her prayers had been filled with no. No to pleasure, no to temptation, no to herself. Now, for the first time, a whisper inside her wondered, what if holiness was not about saying no, but learning when to say yes? That question followed her into sleep like a soft, persistent light. Elna tried to leave the experience behind when she returned home. She told herself it was nothing, an exercise in relaxation, a harmless curiosity. But her prayers no longer felt the same. Each time she knelt, she felt her breath hesitate between the words, as though her body was asking to be included in the conversation. In church, she sang hymns about surrender, and for the first time, she noticed how her voice trembled at the word, surrender. What did it mean to give yourself to something unseen when you had never even learned how to give yourself to yourself? Wooden floor, the deep, wordless peace of simply breathing kept echoing. It had not been sinful. It had been alive. And that was the problem. Her upbringing had never taught her to distinguish between desire and danger. In her world, anything that awakened the body threatened the soul. So she did what she had always done with discomfort. She turned it into discipline. Extra fasting, longer prayers, fewer hours of sleep. She recited verses until her lips ached, asking forgiveness for a feeling she could not name. But guilt has a strange way of sharpening awareness. The more she fought it, the more vivid her memories became. The scent of cedar, the hum of breath, the instructor's words. That is what it feels like when the body says yes. Sometimes, late at night, she replayed that sentence like a forbidden hymn. What did her body want to say yes to? One evening, while grading essays, she caught herself writing the same phrase 3 times. The body is not the enemy. She froze, staring at the words, her pen hovering above the page. A wave of shame washed over her, followed by something else, relief. It was as if a truth had slipped past her defenses before she could censor it. Days turned into restless nights. She avoided her reflection, but the mirror seemed to follow her. Each morning she dressed quickly, buttoned her blouse to the throat, tied her hair back tighter. But control, she was learning, does not erase curiosity, it feeds it. She began reading in secret, articles about mind-body connection, psychology of faith, the physiology of touch. The language felt both foreign and familiar. Words like sensation, presence, consent carried a quiet holiness she had never been taught. One author wrote, "The body always tells the truth. It's the mind that edits." She underlined it twice. It was around that time that Daniel appeared. He was one of the guest lecturers at a teacher's workshop, a visiting instructor in creative writing. His classes were the opposite of deconnected. Hers, unguarded, alive, full of laughter. He quoted poets instead of scripture, encouraged silence instead of answers. When he spoke, he made people feel seen. Their first conversation lasted only a few minutes. He asked her what she taught. She said discipline, without realizing how small her voice sounded. He smiled, as if hearing what she didn't say. "That's a noble subject," he said gently, "as long as you don't forget mercy." That night, she lay awake replaying the words, mercy. She had preached it often, but never extended it to herself. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed again. Staff meetings, shared lunches, short walks between buildings. He never flirted, never pressed, but his presence carried ease, the kind that disarms without demanding. Once, while discussing an upcoming lesson, he asked, "Do you ever feel like your faith lives in your head, but not in your body?" She froze, unsure how to answer. Well, faith is meant to guide the body, not the other way around." He tilted his head. "Maybe," he said, "but don't you think guidance works both ways? The breath, the pulse, they're part of prayer too." It was such a simple thought, but it felt like an earthquake. For days she avoided him, terrified of what his words stirred. Yet part of her knew he wasn't awakening sin, he was awakening presence. One evening after class, she found herself alone in the chapel. The candles flickered, the air still. She whispered into the silence, "God, I don't know how to belong to you and to myself at the same time." Her voice cracked on the word myself, and in that breaking, something inside her finally told the truth. She had been faithful all her life, but never whole. Tears came, not from rebellion, but from recognition. They were the body's confession, spoken in a language older than prayer. The next few months unfolded like a quiet battle between devotion and curiosity. Elna still prayed every morning, still taught her students to guard their hearts, still smiled when colleagues praised her gentleness. But inside, everything was shifting. It was as though her spirit and her body had begun speaking two different languages, and for the first time, she was trying to translate. Her faith had always lived in her mind, clean, articulate, memorized. But the sensations growing inside her were wordless. They came as small interruptions, a warmth in her chest when she exhaled, a softness in her palms when she stopped resisting stillness. None of it felt sinful, yet all of it felt dangerous. She was standing on ground her theology had never mapped. She tried to talk to her pastor once. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When she mentioned that she had begun to feel God through her body, his expression changed. He quoted Corinthians. "The flesh is weak," he reminded her. "The spirit must always govern." She nodded, ashamed of her own curiosity. But something inside her rebelled quietly, not against God, but against the shrinking version of him she had been given. A week later, Daniel invited her to a retreat he was helping organize in Sedona, a small interfaith gathering focused on mindfulness and creative renewal. She almost said no. Every rule in her upbringing told her not to, but when she read the flyer, a weekend for silence, breath, and rediscovery, something in her chest answered before her mind could protest. She said yes. The drive to the retreat felt like leaving one world for another. Red cliffs rose against the sky, the road winding through desert light. The air felt alive, almost electric. For the first time in years, she traveled without her Bible on the seat beside her. Instead, she carried a small notebook and a question she could no longer ignore. What if holiness included the body? At the retreat, the atmosphere was nothing like the religious conferences she knew. There were no sermons, no hierarchies, just people gathered in a circle, barefoot, unguarded. The sessions were simple: breathwork, journaling, guided silence. On the first evening, the facilitator, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, said something that struck her. The body is the first temple. Everything else is decoration. Elna felt her throat tighten. She wanted to cry and didn't know why. That night, in her cabin, she tried to pray, but found herself breathing instead. The words refused to form. The silence, however, did not feel empty. It felt full, like waiting for rain. The next day, during a group exercise on emotional mapping, participants were invited to describe where they felt joy in their bodies. Elna froze. Around her, others spoke freely. In my chest, in my hands, in my belly. When it was her turn, she whispered, "I don't know." The facilitator smiled softly. Then start there. Sometimes the body doesn't forget, it just waits for permission. That sentence lodged deep in her. Later, she would remember it as the moment something fragile began to thaw. That evening, after the final session, she and Daniel sat outside the main hall, watching the desert darken. He spoke first. "You've been quiet today." "I'm trying not to feel too much," she said, half laughing. "Maybe feeling is what prayer becomes when words stop working," he said. The air between them grew still, not heavy, alive. She noticed the rhythm of her breath syncing with his without effort. She wasn't thinking of sin or virtue, only presence. When she finally met his gaze, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, not seduction. A shared understanding of what it means to stand at the edge of everything you were taught and still feel the pull towards something larger. That night, back in her cabin, Elna stood by the window, moonlight brushing her face. She placed her hand over her heart, the way she had done in Oregon months before. Only this time, she didn't resist. The warmth that spread through her wasn't desire, it was permission, her body's first language coming back to her after years of silence. Sat on the floor, tears streaming without pain, and whispered, "Maybe this too is prayer." From that night forward, the questions multiplied. She read sacred texts with new eyes, searching for where love ended and fear began. She noticed how often holiness was described as light, and how often light touched the body before the soul. Still, the old guilt fought back. In the weeks after the retreat, she tried to bury the experience under service, teaching, duty. But repression is a form of attention, and the more she tried to forget, the more vividly her body remembered keys. One Sunday, while listening to a sermon about obedience, her heart began to race. The preacher spoke about control, about purity as armor, but all she could think of was how peace had answered her not through control, but through surrender. The contradiction grew too wide to ignore. She stopped taking communion for a while, unsure of which God she was serving. The one who demanded silence, or the one who had met her in breath. Her colleagues began to notice her distance. "You seem distracted," one said. "Tired?" She smiled politely. She couldn't tell them the truth that she wasn't tired, she was awakening. Elna began keeping a new journal, one she hid under her mattress. In it, she wrote not prayers, but sensations. The pulse under her ribs, the weight of air against her skin, the way grief and gratitude sometimes felt identical. She wrote, "Maybe the body isn't temptation. Maybe it's revelation." It was a dangerous thought, and yet it felt like the first honest one she'd ever written. The more she listened inward, the clearer it became. Faith had never been about denying her humanity. It had always been about remembering that divinity speaks through it. Her old world was collapsing quietly, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was learning to hear God again, only now the voice came from within. The turning point did not arrive as thunder. It came as weather, subtle shifts in light, of kindness in the air, a softness she could not command but could finally notice. Elna returned to Sedona months later for a small weekend circle, not as a believer seeking a sign, not as a skeptic proving a point, simply as a woman ready to listen. The lodge looked the same, cedar, linen, quiet windows, but she did not. The first evening, the facilitator invited them to begin with a practice called orientation. No chanting, no striving, just letting the eyes move slowly across the room, naming what felt safe. Table, lamp, door, sky. The body, the woman said, steadies when it knows where it is. Elna repeated the words silently and felt her shoulders drop. Nothing had been solved, yet she no longer felt lost. On the second morning, the session was titled Consent with Self. The language felt unusual, yet merciful. The instructions were precise. Place a hand where it feels welcome. Ask inwardly if touch is wanted. Wait for the yes or the no, and honor it without negotiation. The facilitator's voice remained even. The body always asks before it gives. Elna realized she had spent years offering answers without ever asking a question. They practiced with layers, first over fabric, then with the bare skin of the forearm, exploring warmth and pressure like notes on a scale. The emphasis was not on intensity, but on accuracy, finding the exact amount of contact that allowed breath to deepen rather than shorten. The moment breath shortened, she paused. The pause became instruction rather than failure. Muscles she remembered from a book unlearned faster than memory. Safety rewires faster than fear. She felt the truth of that line in real time, a soft deprogramming moving through her like rain. After lunch, the facilitator offered a quiet exercise in relational presence. Participants sat back to back, eyes closed, sharing weight through the spine. No one spoke. Elna felt her ribs widen against another person's breath, and something clicked that had not clicked before. Connection. Could be ordinary. It could be supported, paced, honest. It did not need performance to prove it was real. That evening, the group gathered around an outdoor fire. Someone passed a notebook with the prompt, "I am allowed to feel." Each wrote a single sentence, then tore the page gently and fit it to the flame. When the notebook reached Elna, she wrote, "I am allowed to belong to my own body," and felt heat rise behind her eyes. The paper vanished, but the sentence did not. Later, under the pale expanse of desert sky, Daniel walked beside her along a path of low stones. They had not planned to meet. The path had made the decision. Their conversation was simple, weightless. He asked how the day had been. She answered without apology, describing the precise moments when breath had deepened and when it had almost fled. He listened the way water listens to shore. When they reached the small overlook, they stopped without speaking, as if instructed by the horizon itself. In the quiet that followed, Elna sensed the old training rise: explain, contain, refuse. She did not obey it. She placed the hand over her heart the way she had practiced and waited for the answer within. The yes that came was not about him. It was about her. A yes to presence. A yes to staying. A yes to believing that reverence could include the living body. Back in her room, she prepared the space as though hosting someone sacred. Clean sheets, open window, a glass of water beside a small notebook. She dimmed the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed, feet grounded, spine tall, breath unhurried. The evening practice was not a test. It was a conversation. Where do you feel welcome? Where would you like to be met? She asked, then listened. The answers arrived as sensation rather than words. Warmth blooming beneath her palm. A soft tingling along the sternum. A lengthening exhale that felt like permission. She slowed even further. She matched contact to breath. When the mind left ahead, she returned to the anchor she trusted most. Hand to heart, breath to count, body to truth. Calm spread outward in ripples, then deepened, then gathered again. It was not spectacle. It was coherence. Tears came without warning. She did not resist them. Tears and tenderness live in the same nervous system. She had read the sentence before. Now she lived it. The tears were neither guilt nor grief. They were recognition, the feeling of arriving where she had always been welcome and had never been taught to enter. When the wave passed, she lay back and kept listening. Her pulse was steady. Her breath was spacious. Something quiet and undeniable had changed. The room had not shifted. The scriptures on her desk had not moved. Yet a door in her life had opened, and she had walked through it with both feet on the ground. She slept deeply, not as an escape, but as a seal. In the morning, the mirror did not accuse, it acknowledged. The face looking back was the same, and not the same. She touched her sternum lightly and felt that simple, astonishing truth again. Holiness had never required her to leave her body. It had been waiting to meet her there. The weeks after the retreat unfolded like the slow return of color after a long winter. Nothing spectacular, no grand declarations, just a quiet recalibration of everything she once believed about faith, love, and the body that carried both. Back home, Elna moved through familiar rooms as if rediscovering them for the first time. She left the blinds open in the mornings, letting the sun wash over her without guilt. The first time she felt warmth on her bare shoulders, she didn't pull away. She whispered, almost unconsciously, "The body doesn't sin for feeling alive." Her prayers changed shape. They no longer began with confession, but with listening. Instead of begging for forgiveness, she asked, "What do I need to feel safe today?" Some days, the answer was rest. Other days, movement. Sometimes, simply breath. At school, her students noticed she spoke differently, not wider, but easier. When she spoke of faith now, she used new language, not commandment, but connection. She told them, "Holiness isn't what you protect from the body. It's what the body remembers when it feels loved." The words surprised even her, but they felt true. Her relationship with Daniel continued, gentle and unhurried. They saw each other occasionally, no longer drawn by curiosity, but by recognition. There was no need for secrecy, no hunger for proof. Their conversations were full of pauses that didn't need to be filled. Once, while watching rain gather on the window, Daniel said, "You don't reach peace by denying fire. You learn to let it warm instead of burn." She smiled. It was what she had been learning all along. Elna began journaling daily again, not about purity, not about doctrine, but about sensations, the rhythm of breath, the weight of silence, the subtle difference between fear and excitement. She wrote, "Faith used to mean following rules. Now it means staying present." She no longer viewed her journey as betrayal. It was an expansion. The God she had once feared for being too small now felt vast enough to hold all her contradictions. She realized that what she had called loss was actually a deeper form of reverence, the kind that doesn't separate heaven from earth, spirit from skin, prayer from pulse. And so, her devotion continued, not on her knees, but on her feet. Not in denial, but in belonging. Every breath became its own hymn, every quiet act of care, a new kind of worship. She no longer asked where God had gone. She knew now. He had never left. She had simply stopped meeting him halfway. Months passed, and what once felt like rebellion began to feel like rhythm. Elna no longer carried the weight of explanations, only the calm certainty that transformation does not erase faith, it refines it. In her solitude, she reflected on the long path that had brought her here. The years of obedience, the silence mistaken for virtue, night that shattered it all, and the mornings that followed filled with an unfamiliar gentleness. She saw now that her journey had not been about choosing between God and her body. It had been about learning to let them speak the same language. She wrote one evening in her notebook, "Maybe holiness isn't purity. Maybe it's integration." The sentence stayed with her, simple but complete. For the first time, her faith no longer needed witnesses. It lived quietly in the way she treated herself, how she rested, how she listened, how she forgave. The education she once resisted had deepened into wisdom. She understood that emotional and physical pleasure were not opposites of spirituality, but expressions of presence. The body, she realized, was not a test to pass or a danger to contain. It was a map of memory, always trying to lead her home. Sometimes, when doubt returned, she would stand by the window, hand over her chest, and breathe the same question that had started it all. Is this still prayer? The answer was always the same, soft but unwavering. Yes, every breath was prayer. Every heartbeat, a small act of faith. She began to understand why ancient mystics spoke of divine union not as distance, but as merging. The same current that once made her tremble with fear now pulsed through her with recognition. Elna had not lost her faith that night in Sedona. She had met it for the first time. It no longer demanded silence. It invited listening. It no longer punished longing. It blessed it as proof of life. And so she kept walking, a woman once split between spirit and flesh, now whole. Not perfect, just whole. Years later, Elna would say the moment that changed her wasn't the night itself. It was what followed, the quiet mornings, the way breath became steady again, the way her reflection stopped feeling like an accusation. Transformation, she learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums. She no longer measured herself by rules, but by resonance. How peaceful she felt in her skin. How softly she spoke to herself when she failed. How willingly she returned to the body she had once abandoned. There was no dramatic departure from faith, only a return to something larger. An intimacy that held both spirit and flesh in the same forgiving space. Her students years later would remember her not for her lessons on doctrine, but for her calm presence. When one of them asked what she believed now, she smiled and said, "I believe that peace is not earned, it's remembered." At home, her journal remained open on her nightstand, each page a dialogue between body and soul. She often wrote short reminders, as if leaving notes for another version of herself. The body always asks before it gives. Tears and pleasure live in the same nervous system. Pleasure isn't performance, it's connection. She had come to understand that education was not something you teach once, it was something you live quietly until others feel safe enough to ask the same questions. And when they did, she never gave answers. She only offered this: begin with breath. Begin where you are. Sometimes, in the quiet of her room, she would close her eyes and revisit that desert night. The sound of wind through cedar trees, the way her pulse slowed beneath her own hand. She didn't replay the scene for its intensity, but for its truth. That was the night she stopped mistaking control for devotion. The night she realized that reverence and release were not enemies. To anyone who heard her story, it might have seemed like a tale of loss, of faith broken, of vows undone. But those who listened more closely would understand. She hadn't lost anything. She had simply shed what was never hers to carry. And if you, listening now, have ever felt the same fracture, the pull between who you were taught to be and who your body quietly knows you are, perhaps her story is an invitation, not to abandon what you believe, but to inhabit it more fully, to breathe inside your own faith, to feel its texture, to trust that the divine is not watching from above, it's waiting within. Close your eyes tonight. Place your hand where life beats. Ask nothing. Demand nothing. Just listen. That rhythm you hear isn't rebellion. It's recognition. It's the body remembering the sacred.